Hey guys, JV here with a commentary addressing the Dragon Age in space idea that was a popular criticism of the game before it even came out. It's funny how that was one of the biggest criticisms of the game before it came out, before we found all the bugs and technical issues that really kind of controlled the conversation before release. And it's no longer speculation, the Dragon Age in space idea, now that the game has been out for almost 3 weeks. I'm 70-something hours into my playthrough, and I've seen almost everything there is to see so far. I feel like I've played enough to answer the question now, is Andromeda really Dragon Age in space, or more specifically, Inquisition in space? In order to explore that idea, I'm going to draw a lot of comparisons between the two games. Before we jump in, quick reminder that you'll find Andromeda tips and tricks, guides, commentary, and my 100% completion stream on this channel. If any of that content interests you, be sure to subscribe. When I first saw the Dragon Age in space comparison, I thought it was ridiculous. That was my gut reaction because, as we know, Dragon Age and Mass Effect have always been BioWare franchises. They've always had some similarities in some ways, but they've been very different in other ways. It was hard for me to grasp the idea that this wasn't from a content perspective in terms of the lore and the fantasy of the game. We know that Dragon Age is in a fantasy world. It's set in a fantasy setting with its own universe, whereas Mass Effect is its own different world that is sci-fi based and it's got its own universe. So Dragon Age in space, while it may sound like it, doesn't literally mean dragons in space. It doesn't mean that there's any kind of fusion of these different universes together. While that may seem pretty obvious at this point, that was a popular comment that was just planted on a lot of trailers and stuff before launch. I had several Twitter conversations where we didn't get down to the root of it and, completely understand that this is not a conversation or an argument or a discussion about the contents of the game. It's about game mechanics. So Dragon Age in space, this whole issue, the topic of the video, is from a game mechanics and features perspective. It's drawing similarities in how the game plays and what you can do in the game between the two games, not the lore and the content of the universe. Also keep in mind, some of these similarities are shared with other open world action RPG games, but mostly I'm comparing Andromeda with Inquisition. And also keep in mind that a number of Andromeda developers at BioWare worked on Inquisition as well. And this game, Andromeda, was made at BioWare Montreal. It's the studio's first full game. They did assist in previous Mass Effect games, but there is a lot of cross developers going from Dragon Age franchise over to BioWare, and the fact that this is Montreal's first full game. The first huge similarity for me is the open world aspect. There are huge areas to explore in Andromeda, and that's also the case with Inquisition. Now, if you look back at Dragon Age, it's mostly been open since the beginning, since Dragon Age Origins. I think Dragon Age 2 was a bit more linear than the other entries, but Origins and Inquisition were both open, more so than the Mass Effect franchise. If you look at the Mass Effect franchise with Mass Effect 1, that was the only game that was open insofar as the random planets that you could explore, but really it was fairly linear outside of the Citadel and other kind of hub open areas where you could go explore. A lot of the missions were linear. It was point A to point B with a little bit of wiggle room, but fairly linear. In terms of unlocking new places to explore, it's also similar as well. Inquisition unlocks new areas as you get a higher level. I want to say that's how it worked, but in Andromeda it's the same kind of thing. As you progress in the story, the game gives you options for new areas that you want to explore. You can go to Vold or Havarl, and you can go in either order. It doesn't really matter. That's a similar kind of mechanic in Dragon Age as well. They unlock as you progress through the game. Traversing these open worlds is also pretty similar. We have a vehicle, a way to kind of move more quickly in both games. In Inquisition, you had a mount. In Andromeda, you have the Nomad. And also there is fast travel between specific locations in both games. Given the fact that this is all BioWare and we have some of the same devs working on Andromeda that worked on Inquisition, I think it's more than safe and fair to say that Andromeda drew inspiration from Inquisition in terms of being an open world game. Now let's shift over to the questing design, which I think is inseparable from the open world aspect of both of these games. So both games have a series of main missions, side missions, and tasks. Of course, the side missions and tasks are optional. You don't have to do them. The main missions in both games are fairly linear. The other ones are completely optional, and you can kind of go in whatever order that you want. It's non-linear in that way. You can pick up these side missions and tasks, and most of them are not narrative locked. Now, in Andromeda, I don't know if this was true in Inquisition, but in Andromeda, there's some missions that you have on hold that you have to progress in the narrative to unlock the next part of. But for the most part, a lot of these missions are at your own pace. If there's 10 separate things you have to do for a mission, 10 rocks you have to scan, you can scan one of them and then go do a ton of story missions, then come back and do the rest. It really doesn't matter the order that you do them in. And the way that these missions are presented is also very similar. You have big maps. In previous Mass Effect games, you really didn't have a map to look at. You had some maps, I believe, in Mass Effect 1. In Mass Effect 2 and 3, they were only for hub areas like Omega or Citadel, whatever it may be, but you have big maps in Andromeda for everywhere that you go with a ton of objectives. That's the same thing that we had in Inquisition. And this kind of questing system where you have all this stuff to do with big areas is described as MMO-like, and I've seen that be a criticism of Andromeda compared to previous Mass Effect entries where it's like, this is more like an MMO. I don't like that there are huge areas to explore with a ton of things to do. I like more of a linear experience, and that is certainly a subjective thing. Regardless of our opinions on that, that is totally how Inquisition works as well. The questing systems in that respect with the big map, tons of objectives, that is very similar between Andromeda and Inquisition. Next is the comparison between strike teams and war tables. So these are both mini games in each game. In Inquisition, your war table was a mini game where you would send advisors on missions for rewards. You had a set amount of advisors. You couldn't increase your team. You just had 3 of them, I believe, and then you could earn perk points from each advisor to give you straight passive bonuses. And there was no connection to multiplayer with war tables in Inquisition, as far as I can tell. In Andromeda, we have strike teams. You can send small tactical teams on missions for, basic rewards in single player, but also rewards in multiplayer. There is definitely a connection between strike teams and single player and multiplayer, but it's not narrative connected. And I think a lot of the inspiration for the way that strike teams are designed in Andromeda was feedback on Mass Effect 3 and how there was a narrative connection between multiplayer and single player. Of course, there are no perk points tied in with strike teams. Instead, that's moved over to a separate system with Cryopod AVP, which has more to do with the narrative. So I definitely think there is a comparison to be made between strike teams and war table. I think those are similar mechanics. However, there is definitely some borrowing from Mass Effect 3 in terms of how the system is shaped out and how it works in Andromeda. This next similarity, I believe, is one of the stronger ones, and it does kind of have to do with the content. It has to do with the story, in that both in Inquisition and Andromeda, you are part of a larger, greater organization with a central purpose. As the protagonist, you are the main driving force behind that, and your actions do contribute to building that or completing the mission of that central purpose. And so in Inquisition, you are building an Inquisition to solve the problems between the mages and the church, and so on and so forth. In Andromeda, you're not really building the initiative, but you are trying to complete the mission of the initiative in Andromeda. You're trying to secure a future for the Milky Way species in Andromeda. For previous Mass Effect and Dragon Age games, you could argue that yes, that was part of those games as well, but I feel like it's not a central focus. In both Inquisition and Andromeda, that's a central narrative focus and a game mechanics focus. Although I will say almost everything you do in Andromeda gives you viability towards reaching that goal, and it really does tie in better than Inquisition in my opinion. Regardless, that is definitely a similarity between Inquisition and Andromeda. The final similarity I want to make is with combat, and this is a similarity that has progressed across both franchises, across all games. I mean, you look at Mass Effect 1 to 2, huge improvement, 2 to 3, even further improvement, and then 3 to Andromeda is an even bigger step. And then you look at Dragon Age with Origins to 2, and then 2 to Inquisition. Those are also some pretty big steps. In both Inquisition and Andromeda compared to their predecessors, the combat is faster. It's more fluid than the previous entries. I think it's safe to say that Andromeda's combat is faster than Inquisition's. You got a limitless jump jet that allows you to move laterally, forward, backward, jump up in the air, hover, tons of different things that increase the speed and pace of combat. The main difference between these two is that in Inquisition, you could pause and dictate combat through all of your squad mates. You can't pause the game in Andromeda, and you can't tell your squad mates what to do in Andromeda other than form up on a certain place or come back to you, defend a position, stuff like that. There are other small details. I'm sure you guys can come up with a lot of them, but things I'm thinking about are high dragons and architects, really big bad enemies that only exist in certain areas. Once you defeat them, they're completely gone. You get really good rewards from them. Those are definitely similarities. Squad mates, romance, looting, choices, dialogue, all of these things are definitely some similarities, but I think they've been there across the entire franchise of both games. So after laying out these similarities, I think it's more than fair to compare Dragon Age Inquisition and Mass Effect Andromeda from this standpoint. From a game mechanic standpoint, from the way that you play the game and the things that you can do, I can generally agree with the Dragon Age in space point that people are trying to make. And clearly, Dragon Age and Mass Effect have always shared similarities. We just went over a few of those without going into too much detail. But again, from what I've talked about in this video, I think it's more than fair to say that Andromeda drew inspiration directly from Inquisition. Though I do feel you can see some inspiration from the original Mass Effect as well in terms of an emphasis on exploration. And BioWare has talked about how they drew from Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3 and kind of put the best parts together for Andromeda. I could definitely see that. This also got me wondering, why didn't we have this critique comparison before Andromeda? Why did it come about now? Because both of these games have been developed alongside each other for several years now, almost 10 years now for both of them. I think the number one biggest thing is the open world maps and the RPG-like questing structure that really was not in Mass Effect before Andromeda. This really is a shift in another direction that is much more towards Inquisition and really what Dragon Age has been since the beginning, since Origins. Also, this makes me wonder about the Metacritic aggregate scores for each game and how they compare. If there are a fair amount of comparisons between the two, it puzzles me why Inquisition ranges, in the mid to high 80s, where Andromeda is around the mid 70s on critic scores. And I've talked about, the arbitrary nature of those scores, but if you actually read the reviews and not just look at the numbers, which is something I definitely recommend everyone do, the 10 to 15 point difference doesn't seem to be just from technical issues. There's criticisms of the same systems that are in Inquisition and Andromeda, and there is no doubt that Andromeda has technical issues, but again, the difference in scoring doesn't seem to just be the technical issues, and it makes me genuinely wonder what scores would be like if Andromeda came out in 2014 and Inquisition came out in 2017 if they were switched. Hypothetically, bugs and all, I think Andromeda would have had a little bit of a higher score and Inquisition would have had a little bit of a lower score, but again, we're speaking in hypotheticals here. To close out the video, I'm going to ask you all a few questions. Number one, do you think technical issues are the biggest thing that set Andromeda and Inquisition apart? Because we've made a lot of comparisons here. Are technical issues the reason why a lot of people are receiving this game a little bit lower than Inquisition? Let me know in the comment section below. My second question has to do with The Witcher 3. It's undeniable that we live in a post-Witcher 3 RPG world, where every single Western RPG either comes close to or fails to be Witcher 3, and that's the comparison that we make because it's considered the golden standard. And I'll remind you guys that The Witcher 3 was released about 6 months after Inquisition. So do you feel that the comparison to The Witcher 3 did affect the reviews for Andromeda? I think it certainly did, and at the same time, I don't think Inquisition would have gotten such high reviews had it come out after The Witcher 3. There are lots of things to talk about in this video, so share your thoughts in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, remember to hit that like button. I'd really appreciate it, and don't forget to subscribe for more Andromeda tips and tricks, guides, commentary, and my 100% completion stream on this channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.